Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this marvellous event organised jointly by the Royal Institute of Philosophy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. My name is Jocelyn Bell-Burnell, and I'm the current President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And I will do the first part of the introduction, and the President of the Royal Institute of Philosophy will do the second part of the introduction. I'd first like to say just a little bit about the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It is Scotland's national academy. We have almost 1,600 very brilliant fellows, leading academics in sciences, engineering, arts, humanities, social sciences, business and professional circles, and practicing musicians, writers, artists. And our purpose is to advance the cultural, economic and social well-being of Scotland through our fellows. And we also are a source of independent advice, drawing on all those fellows. I get to do the thing that aircraft staff get to do. We are not expecting an alarm, but if there is a continuous sounding alarm, please would you leave as fast as reasonably possible and gather outside, either in Buccleuch Place or in the George Square, usually in the gardens. There'll be some servitors around to guide us. This lecture is going to be filmed and audio recorded, and while on the theme of audio, this means it would be a good idea to put your mobile phone onto silent, and this would be a good moment to do it. Thank you. Can I now invite Professor John Haldane to introduce the Royal Institute of Philosophy and this evening's speaker.
Thank you very much indeed, Dame Jocelyn. So I begin just by saying a few words, if I may, about the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and then as I introduce, as has been said, our speaker, our distinguished speaker. The Royal Institute of Philosophy is based in London. It was founded in 1925. Among the founders were Harold Laski, Alfred Balfour, and Bertrand Russell. And it exists really to try to promote the place of philosophy more broadly in social, cultural, and intellectual reflections. And so it does have a very definite academic purpose, which is served under the directorship of Professor Anthony O'Hare, who's here this evening, is served through a series of lectures that it runs in London, through two prominent publications, Philosophy, its main and principally academic journal, another one called Think, that's more intended perhaps for sixth formers and others who are finding their way into philosophy. But it also supports a series of branches around the country, including in Scotland, but more widely in Northern Ireland also. And it also supports lectures and individual lectures, but also conferences. And there have been a number of Royal Institute of Philosophy conferences here in Edinburgh done with members of the philosophy department at Edinburgh University. I became chair of it a few years ago, and one of the things that I was concerned to do really was to try and extend, enlarge, increase in number, but also in geography, the activities of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. And being a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, I thought that one opportunity in that regard would be to create a Royal Society of Edinburgh Royal Institute of Philosophy lecture, and that's what has brought us here this evening. This is, I think, the fourth of those lectures. And I'm looking now, particularly in the circumstances of Brexit and concerns about a hard border in Ireland and so on, to create, with the Royal Irish Academy, a Royal Institute of Philosophy, Royal Irish Academy lecture. Dame Jocelyn will know this, but perhaps many people will not. The Royal, after partition and after the period that led up to the creation of the Republic, it was always the case that the Royal Irish Academy drew its fellowship from the island of Ireland in total. And so it's been an important institution in maintaining a sense of comradeship and fellowship across that island. But anyway, so the Royal Institute of Philosophy has these various activities, and included among them are distinguished individual lectures And really, we couldn't have done better than have with us Professor Peter Singer as our lecturer for this 2017 lecture. Peter Singer is, people will know, I mean, one of the best known living philosophers. He was educated at the University of Melbourne and then the University of Oxford. He worked with Richard Hare, R.M. Hare, who was a very important figure in the development of Oxford moral philosophy, really from the 1950s on. I think that was some kind of influence on Peter Singer, but Peter Singer's interests moved away from what would be called meta-ethics, the study of the language of morals, to use one of R.M. Hare's titles of one of his books, really into what philosophers sometimes call first order or normative ethics, actually an engagement with immediate and direct ethical questions. And it's in that sphere, really, that his reputation was established and has grown. I discovered, somewhat to my surprise, actually, that I mentioned he was educated at the Universities of Melbourne and Oxford, but before he got to the University of Melbourne, the town of his birth, he was also educated at Scotch College, Melbourne, which is a Presbyterian foundation. I suppose I might say that whatever influence Scotch College might have had, it wouldn't, I think, necessarily be reflected in the content of Peter Singer's first order ethical views. But if I've said the false, he will, I'm sure, correct me. He is currently the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in the Center for Human Values at Princeton and Laureate Professor in the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne. He's the recipient, as you would imagine, of many distinctions, honors, much recognition, and so on. I'll just mention one. In 2012, he was awarded Companion of the Order of Australia, and in the presentation of that, the explanation of the case it was said of him that he's this was being awarded in recognition of his eminent service to philosophy and bioethics as a leader of public debate and communicator of ideas in the areas of global poverty, animal welfare, and the human condition. And that is a very fair and accurate description of his contribution. A contribution which at times has been controversial, and Peter Singer has done nothing to avoid those controversies. Though I do think that he conducts himself in a manner that is designed to try to secure reasonable agreement around disputed matters. Well, his writings are very many, and I'll just mention two or three very briefly before I invite him to speak. There's an essay that's very well known to students of moral philosophy, particularly, as I say, students of first order or normative ethics, engaging with ethical problems, and that was an essay called Famine, Affluence, and Morality, which did a great deal to change ways in which people thought about some of these issues. One way of putting it was that it brought the condition and welfare of faraway peoples very immediately into our consciousness through posing the question of whether, if we don't act to relieve those, we're acting as badly or in some ways equivalently to actually inflicting harms on people. But then, perhaps even better known to a wider audience was his book Animal Liberation of 1973. In 1980, he produced a book which has had subsequent editions, Practical Ethics, which really became a very widely used text in ethics courses addressing various moral problems and so on. The Expanding Circle, a phrase that's very much used with him, enlarging the moral constituency, extended to animals. And then, more recently, The Darwinian Left, Life You Can Save, The Most Good You Can Do, and then, most recently, I think, though he's so productive, I may be one book behind, Ethics in the Real World, which is a collection, really, of shorter pieces published in 1916. Sorry, did I say 1916? My excuse for that is that I have come here via Chile and Texas. And there's a journey, I mean, not immediately here, but I've been recovering in St. Andrews after what was a 40-hour journey back from Chile. But anyway, 2016, yeah. I've got it, right. So we're in for what will be a very interesting presentation. There will be opportunities for questions and discussion and so on. But could I just ask you now to welcome Peter Singer.
Thank you very much, John, for that very kind introduction. You're right that Scotch College did not succeed in inculcating Presbyterianism into me, but it did mean that I grew up with the sounds of bagpipes around when the cadet band would be playing. And it certainly gave me a very good education, which after all is one thing that Scotland is, the Scottish tradition is known for, and that's no doubt why my parents sent me there. Anyway, I want to thank both the Royal Society and the Royal Institute for organising this occasion. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Edinburgh and to speak to you about living ethically. The actual title that I've given a small tweak to here, I wanted to focus on specific problems that we face now in the 21st century, which is not to say we didn't face them earlier, but they are problems that we face in a slightly different form. So I'm going to cover quite a wide range of issues, and I'll have to move fairly quickly. There's no doubt will be things that I will leave out that you think should have been covered, but there will be some time for questions, so if you think that, save your questions until we get there, and hopefully I'll be able to address those issues as well. So I'm going to talk about three separate issues: global poverty, our treatment of animals, and climate change. I'll spend a little less time on global poverty than I would have had I not addressed that particular topic in St Andrews, where I was speaking at a conference on giving, and I believe there may be some people here in this audience who've followed me up from St Andrews. But if you want to ask more about that, please do so in question time. Good. So what is the situation that we live in, and what are our obligations in the world regarding global poverty? Firstly, what do I mean by global poverty? I'm using the World Bank's definition of extreme poverty. That essentially means not having enough income to be able to reliably meet your basic needs. So it's not a relative poverty standard, which we apply in affluent societies, but it's a more objective standard that relates to basic needs. Currently, the World Bank standard is around at $1.90 per day US. Couple of things to be said about that. One is that that's a standard dollar from a few years ago, so if you want to say it's now $2.05, something like that would probably be right. But a more important adjustment is that this is the purchasing power parity in the developing countries of that amount. So what that means is, if you have traveled in developing countries and you think, oh, things are much cheaper, and $2 US, yes, I could buy myself a really good meal, maybe more, for $2. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about whatever it is in the local currency that purchases as much as $2 purchases in the United States. So it's really a quite minimal level. And the World Bank says that there are currently around 700 million people below this line. That's a sign of progress. Many of you might be familiar with a figure of 1 billion people living in extreme poverty. That was correct a few years ago, but fortunately this number has been going down, and perhaps for the first time in the existence of our species, there's now only about 10% of the world's population living at this level where they cannot reliably meet their basic needs. And so sometimes people are very negative about the problem of global poverty. They get the idea that we're just throwing money at this problem pointlessly, it's going down a black hole. But whatever it is we're doing, and I'm not saying it's just aid, obviously it's trade and economic development as well, whatever it is we're doing, we are actually succeeding in reducing the number of people living in this unfortunate situation. But what it means still is that, at least in the most recent years for which we have figures, it still means that nearly 6 million children die, it's children who have not turned 5 years old, die overwhelmingly from preventable poverty-related causes. And that comes to something like 17,000 children per day which is maybe a little more manageable kind of figure to imagine, you can think of going to a football event, football match perhaps at a reasonable sized stadium, not a really huge, not at Wembley, but somewhere more locally. Maybe you can look around and think, yes, there's around 17,000 people in this stadium, and you think of that many people dying each day. And that's a tragedy on a huge scale. Of course, we experienced the tragedy in Manchester a couple of days ago, and no doubt, like I did today in St Andrews, you remembered in silence the victims of that tragedy. But this is happening every day. It's not in the headlines, and it is preventable. Not easily preventable, but we do know what we can do to bring that figure down. As you see here, it's been going down quite steadily over recent years, and this is even more remarkable when you consider that the population of the world has been going up over this period. And we're here talking not of proportion, but of absolute numbers. Now, how are we going to do more? Well, I want to talk about a new movement which some of you will have heard about, but perhaps not everybody, that is taking, I think, a somewhat different approach to charity and philanthropy than the approach we've had in the past. It's known as effective altruism, and as you see here, it's both a philosophy in the popular sense of a way of thinking about your life, and a social movement. The philosophy is simply that trying to make the world a better place should be one of the important goals in your life. You should live so that that is something that you're trying to do. Not necessarily the only thing you're trying to do. It's not a movement only for saints, but something that you bear in mind when you're making choices about a whole range of things, which might be choices from what career to go into if you're young, or choices what to do with your resources, your time, your money, and something that makes the world better should be part of that. But secondly, and perhaps what's most distinctive, is that it draws on reason and evidence to work out how best to do that, the most effective ways to do that. And that's something that the charitable sector has not always focused on. Perhaps surprisingly, because in many other decisions we make, we're very concerned about getting good value for our money. So that if you need to buy something new, whether it might be a toaster or it might be a laptop, you're quite likely to do some research and find out which brand will give you the best the best value for your money. And if you go out and buy a new laptop and somebody says, oh, you bought that, but look, you could have got something that will do all the things that will do, just as good, for half the price, you're going to feel a bit stupid. But when it comes to donating to charities, people typically do not look for evidence that the organisation they're donating to will give them the best value for their money, that it will do more good with their donation than other organisations that they might have donated to. And so effective altruism movement is in a way trying to introduce something more of that attitude into charitable and philanthropic decisions. If you want to look at more, see the website effectivealtruism.org. You'll find a lot on it. Here's one example of the kind of thing they're doing. This is an organisation called GiveWell, started in the United States, which is less than 10 years old, and started to do real research on what charities achieve and at what cost, essentially because the founders, who were working for a hedge fund, making more money than they had expected to make and wanting to give some of it away, realised that there was a vacuum in getting information about where best to donate. These people were used to working with lots of data. They were hedge fund nerds. And when they tried to apply this approach to a choice of charities, there just wasn't the information. They contacted charities. They said they were interested in donating substantial sums, but the charities just could not or would not supply them with the information they needed. So they started doing research and have reviewed many charities. And as you see from this pie chart, they are recommending only a very small number of the charities that they've researched. Now, that does not mean that they found that all of these other charities are not doing any good. Essentially, what they found was that with most of these other charities, they just could not obtain the evidence necessary for them to judge whether they're doing good or not. Some of them, I guess they found were not giving good value for money, but they then ended up with a very small number which they recommend, and if you go to the website and you click on the top charities up there, you'll get some useful information about which ones they've reviewed and are recommending. So that's the kind of thing that the effective altruism movement wants to do so that we can do more good with the resources we put into this area. And here's another website that actually spun off one of the books that I wrote, The Life You Can Save, which I published in 2009, and various people helped me to turn that into a website which also recommends a selection of charities that have been pretty thoroughly vetted and contains other information about getting together with other people to try to support this idea of working to reduce global poverty. Oops, sorry. Okay, so would be a lot more to say about global poverty and effective altruism, but if you want to ask more, please do. It's an area where I think we can do a lot more, and I think given that we have the ability to do more, given that we are affluent people by the standards as compared with people who can't meet their basic needs, I think that it's something we ought to be doing. Now let me talk about questions about ethics and animals, which are also somewhat different from the questions that we've had in the past. I'll start with this because I will guess that everybody, or pretty much everybody in the room, will agree that this is something that we ought not to allow. The bullfight is not permitted, and similar sports involving cruelty to animals are severely frowned upon in our culture. The mainstream view condemns them. But there are many other things that go on a much larger scale that people either do not know about or, if they do know about, seem to at least tolerate or do nothing about. And one example I will give you is this. This is what, when I started writing and researching this area back in the 1970s, was universally known, including in the poultry industry, as debeaking. I criticised it in animal liberation, and some other animal organisations did too, so you won't find the term debeaking in poultry journals anymore. Now you find the term beak trimming, to suggest that this is rather like trimming your fingernails. But it's certainly not. A chicken's beak is full of nerves. It's the way the chicken relates to its environment. It has to be able to peck at the ground and distinguish whether it's picked up a worm or an insect or a grain that it can eat, or a pebble or a stick that it can't. But pretty much every laying hen that lays eggs in a commercial egg production system will have had its beak inserted into a kind of a little guillotine-like device, a hot blade, and then had the end of the beak cut off, cutting through that nerve tissue, as well as, of course, the breeder birds that produce these birds. And this is clearly a very painful procedure, but it's occurring all the time, obviously on a very large scale. And it's something that the culture that condemns bullfighting does not condemn, insofar as it is aware of it, but it's no secret that it happens. So I would suggest that we need to rethink the ethics that rejects bullfighting but accepts debeaking here. What should we be doing in order to reconsider our ethics? I've argued that the ethical approach we have is based on speciesism, which is a term that I took from Richard Ryder, somebody that I got to know at Oxford when I was a graduate student there, and the author of a couple of books about animals. And I think it's a useful term because it makes the parallel with racism and sexism, forms of discrimination that we are familiar with and that we generally reject. Now, as I say, it makes a parallel. This is not to say that the parallels are complete in every respect, but what I think is important is that we are familiar with the idea that racists and sexists and the patriarchy develop sets of ideas that justify their dominant position and their taking for themselves a moral status that entitles them to treat those outside that group in a way that is clearly to their advantage and to the disadvantage of the outsiders. So in the case of racism, the most blatant example of that, of course, was slavery. And we see something similar in the ideologies that existed until relatively recently, may still exist in terms of some people's attitudes, but are no longer really openly espoused, of the idea that essentially men should be dominant in government, in relationships, and in various other spheres of life. So I'm arguing that speciesism is similarly an ideology, a set of ideas, which builds in a bias that we have against taking seriously the interests of other species. But unfortunately, in this particular case, the other species are not really capable of even articulating a challenge. So the rejection of that has to come from the dominant group. It can't come from the oppressed group. Now, what does it amount to if we reject speciesism? It amounts to an application of the principle of equal consideration to non-human animals. Professor Haldane mentioned in introducing me a book called The Expanding Circle, and this is the way in which I think we ought to expand the circle of concern that we have in the 20th century accepted ought to include all human beings. So there's a sense in which we say all humans are equal. We can discuss exactly what that means, but one plausible reading of it is that all humans are entitled to equal consideration of their interests. We shouldn't give less weight to the interests of any human being because of that human being's race or sex, or we might include a variety of other things like religion, sexual orientation, and so on. I would argue that the same applies to the boundary of species. It's a principle of equal consideration for similar interests. So the claim that our interests are different from animals is not incompatible with the idea that we should give equal consideration where the interests are similar or where they can roughly be compared. And that's essentially what I think we ought to do. So if the chick felt pain in the slide I showed you of the debeaking procedure, we should give that pain as much consideration as we would give to a similar amount of pain felt by one of us. Now you might say, well, what's similar? After all, we have different cognitive capacities. We can anticipate pain perhaps in a different way. We remember pain in a different way. All of those things are different. Well, that's true if we're talking about normal humans beyond infancy. But there is a stage when all of us lacked those cognitive capacities and perhaps were more similar to non-human animals in that respect. But I would say that if one were to inflict the amount of pain that was inflicted on that chicken routinely on human babies, and it was not for a really important reason to benefit them, to prevent them getting diseases or something like that, everybody would be saying that's something that we ought not to be doing. And the fact that we're not saying that about the chickens and many other procedures we do to non-human animals is an indication that we're giving less consideration to their similar interests to interests that humans have. Okay, so what is the most important of these issues that we should be addressing? I think that the numbers count. This is consistent with the idea of effective altruism that I mentioned before. I think that we want to do the most good that we can with our resources, and that includes with our time if we're prepared to support causes, whether we support them financially or whether we write to our Member of Parliament or whether we join some kind of protest. We want to focus on the places where we can do the most good. And although the animal movement has paid a lot of attention to other issues, and it's still the case that in terms of money and resources that are donated by the general public to the animal movement, charities that work for abused dogs and cats, or perhaps abused horses and donkeys, tend to get a hugely disproportionate amount of money in comparison to the numbers of abused cats and dogs or horses and donkeys that are suffering. So here's one way of looking at this. If you consider the use of animals in research, which is one of the larger areas of animal abuse, or animal use, I should say. It's not all abuse, but animal use apart from raising animals for food, it's around 100 million. That's worldwide. In this country, I think it used to be, when I started writing this, about 5 million. I think it's fallen to somewhere between 3 and 4. It's a large number, but compare this with the 65 billion animals, and it pales into insignificance. So we have roughly 600 times more animals used in food production than in research, and that's without including fish. So that's why I think this is the issue that we should be focusing on, if you're in agreement with me that we should be giving more consideration to the interests of non-human animals. So you're probably familiar with some of the things that happen, and indeed that still happen. The European Union, I'm pleased to say, has prohibited some of the forms of confinement that I talked about originally in animal liberation. The standard, very small, crowded battery cages for hens, the individual stalls for veal calves or breeding sows are now illegal across the entire European Union. But this is still legal. Very crowded pig production in small group pens is still perfectly standard. And these are intelligent animals who need some stimulation, and if you had them outside would be doing things like rooting around in the ground, hunting for food, looking after their piglets if they were sows, but essentially confined with really nothing to do in the factory farm. And these are the chickens produced for meat, still produced in huge numbers in crowded sheds, maybe 20,000 birds in a single shed. And one of the other problems that has occurred with chicken production is that the birds have been bred over the years to grow faster and faster, to eat more and to grow faster. And so the chickens are now ready for market at around 6 weeks of age. They're extremely young birds. But they are pretty large and pretty heavy, and they've got that heavy body standing on immature bones. So it's not at all unusual that chickens will find that their legs will just collapse under them because essentially the weight of their body breaks their bones. Now, there's no individual attention to these birds in this shed. It simply doesn't pay. They're fed through these pipes which produce food and water automatically to the birds. That's fine if you have legs that work and can get you there. Well, it's not fine because you're still extremely crowded and the air is full of ammonia and so on, but you can survive. But suppose this bird's legs suddenly collapse under it, it's simply going to lie on the floor there and starve to death or die of dehydration. Nobody is going to walk through and find a sick bird and do anything about it. They're simply too cheap, it doesn't pay, and so they die. And although, of course, it's a relatively small proportion of these birds, when you consider the number, this is an immense amount of suffering. And here's a way of looking at that. These are figures from the United States rather than this country. I don't have figures from this country, but the proportions are probably not that different. Now, on the right, what we're showing here is, as it says, the number of animals killed in shelters, for fur, and in research each year added together, 25 million. What you have here is not the number of chickens who are killed for food. If we were looking at the United States, that would be vastly larger. It would be somewhere around 8 billion. It's the number of chickens who die before they're ready for slaughter. So it consists to a significant extent of the birds I just mentioned, the birds whose legs have collapsed under them and who've therefore starved to death or died of dehydration. There may be various other causes that lead them to die before they're ready for slaughter. But so even if you think that the way of rearing that I showed you here is not cruel, and even if you think that slaughter, the transport to slaughter is humane, which I really would doubt you could think if you knew much about it, and even if you thought that the actual slaughter itself is humane, you should still think that the chicken industry is productive of much more cruelty and animal suffering than all of the shelters, all of the fur farms, and all of the research done each year, because this number is so much larger, as you can see, almost 6 times as much. And these animals, I would say, suffer more on average than the animals in this group. Although that's a bit of a guess, it's hard to know exactly, but they are dying painfully and slowly, not humanely by any stretch of imagination. And I think the proportions, as I say, would be similar in this country, even though the numbers would obviously be smaller. Okay, what do we do about that? What does it take to live ethically in regard to this? I think that it takes a boycott of these methods of treating animals. Now, you can do that in various ways. You can stop eating animal products at all and become vegan. You can become vegetarian and you won't be eating this kind of chicken. Or you can boycott factory farm products and make sure that whatever animal products you get come from more traditional, perhaps organically labelled, certified humane ways of producing animals. All of those are vastly better than simply going down to your supermarket and picking up whatever's cheap, which is going to be factory farmed animal products. And again, if you like, in question time, we can discuss the options, the considerations that might lead you to one or other of these options. There is, I also mention, a third reason for shifting to a vegan or plant-based diet, and that is the greenhouse gas emissions of the animal industry. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization said about 10 years ago that the livestock sector generates more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transport sector, than all of the cars, trucks, planes, trains, ships, etc. So it's a very significant part of the problem of global warming, and it's another reason for avoiding animal products. And the answer to this question is of course it's rearing cattle that causes more emissions than driving cars. So sure, ride your bike rather than drive your car, or if you must drive a car, find a very fuel-efficient hybrid, but you'll probably do more to reduce your greenhouse gas emission by moving to a plant-based diet than either of those things will do. And that's a segue to my third and final topic of what it is to live ethically in the 21st century, and that is climate change. And this, of course, is the problem that is really the distinctive problem of the 21st century, the one that's most urgent for us to solve, that has not existed previously, or perhaps existed in the last third of the 20th century. We became aware of it, but it really has to be solved and dealt with in this century, or it's not going to be solved in time to avoid very serious consequences, which I will now say a little bit about. Firstly, I want to say just a little bit about the science, because not everybody is always as clear on this as and the issues that they ought to be. This is a slide that I found as perhaps the most clear visual way of showing that the planet is warming. You look at this period of temperatures looked at over this, when does it begin? 1880 to roughly the present, and you take the average the average world temperature for that entire period, and then you look at each individual year, was it above or below that average? And when you do that, you get a very clear pattern falling out, so that all of the years up to about 1940 were below average. Then you got a little warm period followed by a colder period and so on. It went up and down for a little while, but then it settled into a warming trend. And so since sometime in the 1970s, every year has been above the average for that last 137 years. And as you can see, the trend, even though again there's ups and downs, the trend is upward, and the last couple of years have been hotter than any year that since we've been recording. So I think there's no doubt that our planet is getting warmer. That does not in itself say what the cause of this warmth is, but the overwhelming consensus of scientists is that human emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases has played the major part in this. So they say in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change most recent assessment report, they say it's extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century, and they give a technical reading of extremely likely, 95 to 100% probable. So only one chance in 20 that they're wrong. But some people, of course, question that judgment and say, well, how do we know? Science has got things wrong before. And then the question is, what are the risks that we're taking if we were to bet on the idea that the consensus of scientists is wrong? So here are the things that are probable consequences of warming. More and longer heat waves, more heat deaths, more severe floods, storms, droughts, lower crop yields, sea level rises. Actually, on the most recent predictions that I've seen, this might be conservative, although it's still a very significant sea level rise. But the New York Times just ran a series of articles on the possibility of the West Antarctic ice sheet breaking off and melting, which would cause much greater sea level rises than this. Possibly may not happen before 2100, but some risk at least is there. But even on these levels, when you get storm surges, you will get enormous damage to coastal cities, some of these things have already happened, as with New York in Hurricane Sandy a few years ago, but they'll get significantly worse if we do have say a half a metre sea level rise. Oceans will become more acidic because they absorb more carbon dioxide, and that's a bad effect in itself. And people have got very worried about refugee numbers as a result of the war in Syria and other conditions in North Africa. But I think what we've seen could be very minor compared to the refugee numbers that could arise if some of these predictions occur. Because if rainfall patterns change, for example, then hundreds of millions of people who depend on rainfall for subsistence farming are not going to be able to do that. So they will at least become displaced persons within their own countries. And if their own countries offer no way of providing them with a livelihood, they're obviously going to try and come elsewhere. So those are some of the problems. And if we say, as I said, the science might be wrong, and let's admit that that's possible, the question is, what would follow from that? What would be the ethical thing to do, even if we acknowledge that the scientists are wrong? Well, the level that we're working at now is the idea that we don't want temperatures to rise more than 2 degrees Celsius, that this was agreed back at the first Rio summit, that this would be a dangerous level, that things would get out of control. And so we're trying to avoid passing this level. Now, one of the things about this level is that it's likely that we will get feedback loops coming into operation. What you're seeing here is the loss of Arctic sea ice. This is what has already happened over the past 30 years. You're seeing variations with each year, but you can see if you look at the 2010 figure here that it gets considerably smaller than what it was in 1990. Now, as you'll know, anybody who's been on snow knows that snow or ice is very good at reflecting sunlight. It reflects it into your eyes. You need to wear sunglasses. On the other hand, dark ocean waters do not reflect sunlight to anything like the same extent. They absorb it. So when we lose ice over the Arctic Ocean or over Siberia or other places, we are losing the ability to reflect some of the sun's heat, and the Earth is absorbing more heat from the sun. So if we lose more of that ice, then we build up a feedback loop, which means the Earth will warm even more, even if we were to stop greenhouse gas emissions from that point on. So that's what's meant by saying this is a dangerous level. It's a level at which things will get out of control. We no longer can just turn off the tap by cutting out greenhouse gases, even if we could do that. So that's why it's dangerous. And given the levels that we're getting at, we can reach more of these tipping points. And as I said, there'll be more severe consequences coming from that. Much greater sea level rises, much greater fluctuations because of intensified El Nino effect, so greater periodic droughts either on the west coast of the Americas or on Australia, and greater floods, that's with El Nino, and then greater floods when you get the La Nina effect. More loss of Amazon rainforest, which is another feedback loop because it puts more carbon back into the atmosphere. And particularly relevant to the British Isles, I suppose, is a possible change of direction of the Gulf Stream, in which case things will get very seriously colder here rather than warmer. But of course, in terms of large numbers of people affected, the weakening of the Indian monsoon could be another catastrophic change, which would lead to hundreds of millions of people being unable to support themselves. So these are the possible consequences. Now, if we, scientists have estimated that the levels of carbon dioxide that will create these degrees of warming, we're now at 410 parts per million, and if you want to, I checked that a week or two ago, if you want to keep checking it, you can go to co2.earth, and it could get significantly higher, and as we get higher, we get greater warming. But the figure that I want you to look at now is this figure, that if we get to 430 parts per million, then getting to 2 degrees Celsius, or exceeding it, is 66% probable. And if we're now at 410 and we're not really drastically slashing those emissions, it seems almost inevitable that we will get to 430 in another couple of decades. So we don't have very much time to do that. And if we exceed that, then of course we're likely to go over that 2 degrees barrier. So really, when you think about this, we are already gambling with the future of our planet. And even if you think the science might be wrong, what are the odds that the science might be wrong? And is it worth taking that risk with the future of everybody who will live on this planet throughout the 21st century and for many centuries beyond? So essentially what I'm arguing is that it's as if we're playing Russian roulette here, but not just with our own lives, but with the lives of billions of people elsewhere on the planet who are less well able to defend themselves against climate change than we are, and of course with the lives of future generations. So that's why even if I were to accept that the prediction that, or the theory that it's human greenhouse gases that are warming the planet, even if I was to accept that there's a greater than 5% chance that that is wrong, I would still think that we ought to follow exactly the same path, that it would still be unethical to relax our efforts to reduce greenhouse gases because it would not be ethical to take this gamble. It would not be ethical to play Russian roulette with the lives of so many other people. And on the other hand, if you consider it's kind of a balance, we're taking this risk if we go on. What are we losing if we do drastically cut greenhouse gases? Yes, we're undergoing some hardship. Yes, it may somewhat reduce our productivity, but essentially the costs are going to be vastly less than the costs if we don't do this and if the scientists are right. So that's why I think this is a major ethical problem, major ethical dilemma that we each have a responsibility to do something about. The next question, of course, is what should we be doing about this? Sorry, I should mention this. In order to try to stay below this 2 degrees Celsius, we are going to have to not burn all the fossil fuel we've discovered. So even though companies have been exploring for fossil fuel and continue to do so and have discovered further deposits of coal and natural gas and oil, we cannot dig up and burn all of this. If we do, there's, I think, no doubt at all that we will pass this 2 degrees Celsius level. So we're going to have to give up the use of cheap energy that exists and move to cleaner energy, even if it is somewhat more expensive. Now, another ethical issue that then follows from this is that we have to decide how we're going to allocate this remaining rather small capacity of the planet to absorb our greenhouse gases. So this is an ethical issue in terms of distribution of a scarce resource. And one way of looking at this is to look at a couple of maps that I'll show you, which firstly shows which nations are responsible for the problem, which nations have caused this problem by their emissions of greenhouse gases over the past. This is actually a relatively short period, just going back to 1950. Some charts could say, well, you need to go back to the Industrial Revolution, because that's when this country started dramatically increasing its emissions of greenhouse gases, and the United States and a little bit later. But this is somewhat more generous. It's saying, okay, we'll only go back to 1950. But you can still see, if you look at this, that some countries bulk very large relative to their emissions, and other countries very small. United Kingdom up here has certainly swollen quite a lot. The United States has swollen much more. And compare that with Africa, where sub-Saharan Africa has really shrunk away almost entirely, except for South Africa, which is somewhat larger. So very little responsibility for creating the problem here, a lot of responsibility here and in Europe, of course. And then compare that, if you can hold that image in your head, compare that with who is going to be harmed most by climate change. And now Africa has grown enormously. It's going to be harmed partly because it's already hot and it already depends on fragile rainfall patterns. And that's going to change more, and partly because they don't have the resources to really defend themselves against it in the way that other nations do. So now the United Kingdom has shrunk to a tiny little thing down there. The United States has got really skinny, but that's because these kinds of causes of fatalities, malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and flood, are not going to be a problem here, but they are a huge problem in developing countries, and especially in Africa. So I think that's one reason for thinking that the responsibility for doing something should fall on the developed countries. Whoops, sorry. Another way of saying, you might say, well, yes, but we didn't really know what we were doing in 1950, which may be true, but certainly by the 1980s we knew what we were doing. But even if you were to wipe that and say, forget about historical responsibility, what should we do from here on in? Then one way of saying would be, well, let's have everybody in the world have an equal share of the right to put greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So just total it all up, divide it up in accordance with population of different nations, and what do you get then? Well, you still find that pretty similar countries need to do more of the cutting. So the United States has a fifth of the world's population, but emits a 16th of the world's greenhouse gases, so more than 3 times its per capita share. China, somewhat more than its per capita share. India, a lot less than its per capita share. And the EU nations and the UK are somewhere in between the United States and China, certainly significantly over, I think maybe something like close to twice or 1.5 times their per capita share. So again, the burden falls on the industrialized developed nations. And if you want to take the last view of justice, if you want to follow the views of John Rawls, the late 20th century American philosopher who wrote a big book called A Theory of Justice, he thinks that inequalities are just only insofar as they actually benefit those who are worse off. So this is a somewhat more demanding standard than simply equality. And the result of that, of course, would also be that it's the developed nations that need to do more, because certainly the inequalities that we have in emissions today are not designed to benefit the worst off. They're actually doing the most harm to the worst off. So here's an example of some of the people who are poorly off. There's a flood in the Philippines, which has inundated houses, causing them to collapse. And these are the kinds of people that we're affecting by our continuing emission of greenhouse gases, who do not have the resources to defend themselves against it. And so then what should we do? Well, I've already mentioned changing our diets, and we can certainly do things like using public transport more. It's a shot from Copenhagen. Those are good things to do to reduce our own personal emissions. As I said, I've mentioned changing what we eat. But in this case, I don't think this is enough. In contrast, perhaps, with things like global poverty, where I think we could make individual efforts, where we make a significant individual impact, of course, adding to the efforts that we are making through our governments. But I think here we actually, the most important ethical imperative is to become active citizens. I think we need to see this as a campaign of tremendous urgency. We need to see it as a great wrong that we're doing. When I was a graduate student at Oxford, it was during the Vietnam War. There were large rallies and demonstrations outside the American embassy. It was a major issue, even though the United Kingdom was not itself involved. Australia, where I'd come from, was involved, and also there were a lot of protests and demonstrations. We saw that as a really urgent issue, and of course we had vivid images of what was happening in Vietnam. Some of the older ones of you in this audience will remember that naked child who'd been napalmed running down the street, a very vivid image. We don't have the same images of climate change, despite the image that I showed you a moment ago of the house sliding into the water. Somebody will say, well, you can't prove that was climate change. There are always floods occurring somewhere or other. And that's true. But somehow we need to get this issue across and to see that, in fact, it's even more important than the Vietnam War. It's affecting even more people. It's affecting them for an even longer time. And it's just as much a harm, a wrong that we are doing to them as the Vietnam War was a wrong that the United States and Australia were doing to the people of Vietnam. So this is, I think, one of the big challenges for living ethically in the 21st century is how do we get this across? How do we make this an important issue? And how do we ensure that our politicians really not only ensure that our own countries are reducing greenhouse gas emissions to the maximum possible extent, but also that they are calling on other nations to do so. And particularly since the election of Donald Trump, that becomes a particularly important global issue, that those nations that have a better record and that are more aware of this issue and do not describe global warming as a Chinese hoax, as Trump did when he was a candidate, although he interestingly did not say that when he wanted the support of the Chinese government in containing North Korea. So as with many other issues, he's changed his rhetoric a bit, but it's really important that other nations say that they will not accept the United States failing to meet, at a minimum, the commitments it made in Paris in December 2015. Those commitments are not really enough. But we have to take a stance where we can see that if nations do walk away from that, essentially they are free riders. They are getting cheaper energy for their own industry at the cost of harming the rest of the world. And we need to find ways of preventing that, and if it happens, of retaliating against it, perhaps through our trade policies, so that no nation can benefit and be a free rider in this situation where all of the world is involved. So that's why the ethics of the 21st century simply has to be a globally focused ethic. Thanks very much for your attention.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. So we have a number of microphones. Could I ask you to clearly put up your hand if you have a question or a point you wish to make? We'll identify you. And if you could put those questions or points pretty briefly, please, but hold the microphone close to your mouth so we hear from you. So we'll start over here. I think there are a couple of people pretty immediately there.
Thanks so much for the talk. In your very first book, I believe it is, called Democracy and Disobedience, you try and outline the situations in which it's permissible to break the law. And you say that equal participation and fair compromise are the reasons that need to obtain, otherwise you're not allowed to break the law. So animals, for instance, obviously clearly don't have equal participation, and the global poor, for instance, we could say, in maybe less clearly, but you could argue also don't have equal participation in the decisions that affect them. So to what extent do you think that changing your eating habits or being an active citizen in terms of going on some demonstrations does not suffice to combat some of these problems? So what I mean by that is, what do you think are the limits to what is permissible to do in terms of breaking the law, sabotaging fossil fuel consumption, production, animal slaughtering, and so on? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. You're quite accurate about what I argued in my first book, which was, of course, written during that Vietnam era when there was a lot of discussion about disobedience to the law. I argue in that book that it is permissible sometimes to break the law in order to stand by an important moral or political point of view. But I also argue that this should, in virtually all circumstances, be non-violent, be civil disobedience. And I continue to hold that view. As far as the animal movement is concerned, we've seen over the years both non-violent civil disobedience and some episodes, I think very regrettable episodes, of the use of violence, of sending letter bombs to people experimenting on animals, for example. I don't know that in that particular case either of those forms of disobedience have really contributed significantly to the changes that we have seen, the progress, which, of course, as I've said, is not nearly enough. But in particular, I think the letter bombs and the use of violence had a really negative effect. I think for some years, really, the movement was unable to make progress because people didn't want to make concessions to a movement that appeared to be prepared to use violence. So that was always clearly just a handful of people in a movement of tens of thousands or millions of people. In the case of climate change, there has been some disobedience, generally civil disobedience too. And I think for the reasons that I gave at the end of what I was saying, it would be justified to engage in civil disobedience to prevent, for example, the opening of new coal mines or the putting in of the pipeline that would take Canadian shale oil into the United States, which is a very fossil fuel intensive form of oil. So to me, those things would be justified in themselves if they were non-violent, but you still have to ask the question, are they likely to be effective? In the present climate, would they make a difference? Would they lead to more people rallying to the cause? Or would it be possible to discredit the cause by saying that these people are terrorists? Although, as I say, I would never defend anything like that. I think that's the question. But if somebody were to conceive strategies that would really seriously reduce the burning of fossil fuel by engaging in a concerted campaign of non-violent disobedience in which you could expect large numbers of people to take part, yes, I think that could be defended.
There was another question in that area. We'll take the lady just up there, and then we're going to move over here. There's somebody there, and there's somebody, yes, the gentleman there, and then a gentleman here. So please.
Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. My question is, what is your view of lab-grown meat? What are the ethical concerns there? And is there a danger that instead of becoming an alternative to animal farming, it will just become just an additional source of meat and will reinforce the meat culture?
Right. So in ethical terms, if you can produce meat, which is biologically meat, but has not harmed any sentient beings because it was grown at the cellular level, then I think that would eliminate the ethical problems involved in the treatment of animals on farms that I showed you. It's also predicted that this would eliminate, I've seen the figure of 97% of the greenhouse gases involved in the production of meat from living animals, so it would be greatly superior in that respect as well. So if that could be done, I think that would be entirely ethical to consume that meat, and indeed I would encourage people to buy it in order to make sure it gets established on the market. I would hope that, and of course we're not there yet, but we may get there. I've seen predictions of 10 years or more, who knows, but we may get there. If it does happen though, I do think it would have the potential to actually replace meat, because the idea is that it would be taste very similar, it would be nutritionally similar, it would actually eliminate the health risks of salmonella and other diseases that exist with meat. And it would be ecologically friendly, as I say, which would appeal to some customers, but it would be cheaper. So if you could do that, then I think you would be replacing meat. Now, initially I think that would only happen for a kind of ground beef type meat, hamburger meat. It would be longer still before it would replace T-bone steak or something like that. But the other thing I'll say is, I don't think the alternatives to meat have to be lab-grown meat, because there are companies working on producing plant-based meat-like substances, which are quite similar in texture and taste. In fact, there was an amusing episode that happened in the United States a year or two ago, when Whole Foods Markets, which is a large supermarket chain that specialises in I guess organic and environmentally friendly produce, mixed up, it was selling faux chicken salad. In other words, it was selling chicken salad with pieces of white stuff in it that tasted like chicken but were plant-based. And it was also selling real chicken salad in similar containers, and it mixed them up. It put the fake chicken into the real chicken salad. And it was a month before they themselves discovered that they'd been doing this. And during that month, not a single consumer had complained that what he bought didn't taste like chicken. So at least in that, maybe pieces of white chicken meat in a salad dressing or something in mayonnaise are not the most high gourmet kind of meat that you would expect to taste in a certain way. But still, in those areas, we're getting very close.
Gentleman here, if we can. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Related to climate change, since many of the people in this audience might be researchers, then one of the things that they might be able to do that will be to do research into climate change and mitigation. So I'm interested in your attitude to the ethics of research into climate engineering. because many people feel that this is unethical because actually it stops us trying to change our fundamental behaviour. But if obviously if it becomes a critical situation, then having the options to carry out climate engineering might be something that will be ethically good.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There is a moral hazard in research into climate engineering. It's the same moral hazard that if you take out an insurance policy that fully covers the value of your bicycle, you might not be so careful about locking it up when you leave it. So that's why some people don't want to do research on it. But I'm not of that view anymore. Perhaps I was at first, but as the years have gone by and we haven't taken the action that was necessary, I now think it might be worth taking that risk and at least doing some research to see how feasible this is in case things really get very dire. It wouldn't, at least no known method of geoengineering is actually going to solve all of the problems, I think. For those who are not familiar with it, this is things like putting particles in the atmosphere, sulfate particles perhaps, to mimic volcanic eruptions. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines, the particles reflected back sunlight and appears to have cooled the planet for a couple of years. So you would have to make sure that they stayed up there to keep the planet cooling. That's just one of a number of things that have been discussed. But it doesn't do anything about the acidification of the oceans, which I mentioned, so we would still have problems with continuing to emit carbon dioxide. But maybe we could avoid some of the most catastrophic consequences, or at least gain time in order to reduce carbon emissions. So, somewhat reluctantly, I find myself saying, yes, it is worth doing research on this now.
This gentleman here, sorry, if we can... Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for an interesting talk. My question takes you to your first theme of poverty. And I wonder, please, your thoughts on the ethical issue of the underlying questions that are being raised increasingly these days of the pay and bonuses that is going to chief executives and a very few numbers of individuals within an organisation compared to the average pay of those who work within the organisation, do their pennyworth, but are paid substantially less.
Yes, so you're raising the issue of inequality, effectively, which there has been a lot of concern about. And it does seem that some of these salaries are close to obscene in terms of the proportion that they get and the proportion that workers got. And they certainly have increased over a number of years. And it's not, of course, only the salaries, but it's also the amounts that people who start companies and startups and happen to be lucky can earn. I'm pleased to say that some of those startup owners have actually been very philanthropic. Bill and Melinda Gates, Warren Buffett have given away huge amounts specifically to work on issues relating to global poverty, and that's good. But we still do have a problem. But when you mention inequality, I think it's also important that we think about ourselves in relation to other people. So in the United States, there was this focus on the top 1%. The Occupy Wall Street movement always talked about the top 1%, and we need to do something to ensure that the top 1% pay their fair share of taxes, for example. And certainly I totally support that. We do need to do something. But if we look at this globally, how much do you think you have to earn to be in the top 1% of the world's income? The answer in pounds is 40,000. So those of you earning more than £40,000 a year in this room, you're in the top 1%, globally speaking. So, that I think shows that we also have an obligation to do something for people who are at the bottom of the world. Thank you.
A question about personal calculations and climate change. You're based in Princeton, and I presume you did not come here on a bicycle. So at some point...
I used a kayak.
Good man. At some point you'd have got on a plane. At what point do you say this plane trip is worth the CO2 production because of what I'm going to do? And a kind of follow-on question from that, speaking as an aerospace engineer with an interest in this, do you have any confidence that the Elon Musks of the world are actually going to sort this out?
Two good questions. Okay, so I would not have thought it worth coming crossing the Atlantic on a plane in order to give this lecture alone, or even to give a couple of lectures. My general policy now has been that if I get invitations to lecture in Europe, I will string a number of them together. And I'm actually, on this trip, I'm spending about 4 weeks in Europe. I've given already 3 lectures, and I'm giving another 3 in the UK, and then I'm going to the Netherlands and a few other countries. So I hope that that makes it worth it. I hope this is not just sort of rationalising the fact that it's, I love being in Edinburgh on a beautiful sunny day like this, which I couldn't predict, of course, when I booked my ticket. But I hope that it's doing enough good. But I do think we need to think about that aspect of travel. Now, the question about Elon Musk is really interesting. So he's trying to do a variety of things, but particularly in relation to climate change, I suppose. He's trying to produce an electric car. Has produced an electric car. The Tesla is a very nice electric car, at the moment rather expensive. He's trying to produce a more popular version. But whether an electric car will solve our problems will depend on how the electricity you charge it up with is produced. So if you're in a country that has a lot of clean energy, whether hydro or solar or nuclear, okay, that's a good thing to do. If you're in a country that still burns a lot of coal, or perhaps in the United States it's now switching over to natural gas to some extent, it's not that clean, even if it's electric. So I don't think that's enough to solve the problems.
Right, I'm going to give us some time for a few more questions, but can you get, yeah, this lady here, and can I just have somebody over on this side? Is there somebody who wanted to ask a question? I thought I saw somebody. Yeah, okay. So we'll have you after that. Right, please. Where is she?
Okay,
yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. I was going to ask, do you think it's not dangerous to suggest to people to buy kinder meat, dairy and egg options when labels such as Red Tractor, RSPCA assured and free range are kind of more marketing ploys than actually meaning anything for the animals, and free range animals still suffer unnecessarily in immense amounts? So for example, I've spoken to the Happy Egg Company, and they still debeak their chickens and kill their hens when they're 72 weeks old and kill every single male chick by CO2 gassing. So people might think that by switching from Tesco Everyday Value eggs to the Happy Egg Company, that actually doing something good, when in reality it's still immense suffering for the animals. So do you not think it's better to just solely focus on saying it's not acceptable to use animals at all, rather than, oh, maybe if you buy free range, they'll suffer 2% less? Because if they're still suffering for no reason, then in my view that's unacceptable, even if they may be suffering slightly less than true factory farm-raised animals. So that picture of the chickens that you showed, something very similar to that might be considered free range because they're not in individual cages. And when people think of free range, they think of animals roaming around fields, like in some kind of magic mystery land that doesn't exist. When people buy into these labels, they don't realise that what they're actually paying for is still massively abusive. So do you think that it's responsible to suggest buying that?
Right. Okay, I'm not going to endorse all of your estimates. I'm not going to say that free-range hens suffer 2% less. I'm not sure how one would estimate what the percentage is. It may be quite a lot larger than that, but I'm certainly not going to disagree with you that there is still suffering in commercial animal production. And some of the things that you mentioned are pretty much inevitable. If people are going to produce eggs commercially, they are going to kill the males of the egg-laying breed because they have no commercial value. And the debeaking, certainly, as you say. Well, the debeaking isn't inevitable. If they have smaller flocks and they have plenty of space, they wouldn't have to debeak, really. But basically, I agree with you that there are these problems. But the question is, what is going to get people to shift? What is going to get people to move? And I think there are a number of people who are ready to shift over to a vegan diet, and it's actually been very gratifying to see the increase in vegan foods in many different parts of the world. And I did have an hour or so to walk around Edinburgh today, and I was pleased to see lots of places advertising vegan foods as I did so, and I'm pretty sure if I'd been here a decade ago that would not have been the case. So that's very encouraging, and for those who are ready to try this and move to it, I definitely think that's the most ethical course you can take. But I am also concerned to try to get people who are not ready to take that step to do something that will reduce the amount of suffering that they're responsible for. And I think moving to non-factory farm products is still a positive step, and may actually, once they make that step, they may see that it's not so hard to move further as well. I think that's the process that I'm trying to get going.
Thanks for your talk. I'm just interested where you would draw the line in terms of the rights of the animals. And whilst you might be against sort of killing chicks, maybe not necessarily killing of insects or ants, and whilst you advocated a vegan or a vegetarian diet, for example, eating bread and the farming of wheat results in deaths of insects and so on. And I'm interested just where the line is in terms of how we live our lives and which animals are worthy of our sympathies and which aren't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So I can answer that in ethical terms. The animals that are worthy of our sympathies are those that are conscious beings that can feel pain. Some people use the word sentient beings. So if they can suffer, then I think they're worthy of our consideration. But as a philosopher, I can't tell you whether the insects that you're referring to are or are not capable of suffering. It's actually, I mean, there is a philosophical question there. What kinds of behaviour or what kinds of anatomy or neurology or whatever would we regard as evidence of a capacity to suffer? But I don't really think anybody knows. We are actually, people are starting to think a bit more about that. There have been a few articles published in recent journals about whether insects could have the capacity for pain. And of course, when we say insects, we're talking about an incredible range of species, much more diverse than the range of vertebrate animals. So it's quite possible that some insects can feel pain and others can't. So I don't really know the answer to that. In terms of other animals, we now have very good evidence that some invertebrates do seem to be conscious. The octopus would be the clearest example of that. A very interesting example because the evolutionary parting between us and the octopus is so ancient that it really means that mind has evolved twice, at least twice, on this planet, separately. And that's interesting. But then you take simpler mollusks like an oyster. Seems to me probably doubtful that an oyster can feel pain. So I hope that we'll gradually find out more and gradually build up a better sense of what the answer to your question is, but we don't have it yet.
Please.
Thank you very much for the talk. I've got a question about eating animals. What if in the case of if we feed them and take care of them, and then if we protect them from disease, and if we kill them without pain, and the sum of human beings' happiness and satisfaction outweighs their interest, can it be ethical or justifiable?
Well, so if you're talking about commercial production, it's unlikely, as the lady behind you said, it's unlikely that is going to be the case. But we can imagine, if you want to say, well, suppose I have some land and I run a few chickens or something like that, and they have a great life and I make sure they do, and then I kill them quickly to eat them. So it's possible to do that. I personally would not, I don't feel any need to do this, and I would not want to do it. But I admit that if somebody did want to do it, and if they really were conscientious about giving these animals a good life, I would find it hard, from the kind of ethical view that I hold, to say it was wrong, because I don't think it's the killing as such. If the killing is done painlessly, I don't think it's the killing as such that is the great wrong. It's more the amount of suffering we inflict, and in the example you're describing, that would not occur.
Thank you very much. I think my question is really, it's about what are your thoughts on the killing of wild animals for the purposes of ecological management? And I know in Scotland, obviously with red deer, I mean, that is a major problem in the Highlands of Scotland, and so I'm just interested in your views on that.
Yes. I'm not going to specifically comment on that problem because I don't know a lot about it, but I do know other problems relating to wild animals. In Australia, obviously, we have a lot of feral animals that Europeans introduced when they came to Australia that have caused serious environmental problems, from rabbits and foxes, and we have wild horses and donkeys and so on. And some of them can be very damaging to the environment. But I still would not want to see them killed in methods that are painful, at least. And unfortunately, a lot of the methods used in Australia are causing very severe suffering. So myxomatosis was introduced to kill rabbits. It's a horrible disease that causes them to go blind and lame and die over several days. I don't think that was justified despite the ecological damage they were doing. If you have a problem with red deer and if there is no other way around, I mean, the ideal solution to me would be some form of population control. And I know in some small places that's been done. There's some islands off the Delmarva Peninsula in the United States. That's the Maryland, Delaware, that peninsula off the Chesapeake Bay, where there was populations of horses that were expanding. And there, in that rather constricted local area, they could dart them with an implant sterilising agents. So if maybe that's a possibility with the deer, and maybe it would work. If that's not a possibility for some reason, I suppose I would say if you employ expert marksmen who can kill them with a bullet through the brain, that would be the best option. But other crueler methods I would not endorse.
On that note, I'm going to ask Dame Jocelyn if she'd be good enough to give a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for a superb lecture. Very clear, very accessible. And as a scientist, I was delighted to see the use of data and evidence. Not always there. Thank you also for pointing to the websites that rate the charity's effectiveness. I didn't know such things existed, and that is incredibly useful. There's one area where we haven't gone, where I think many of us, in addition to being active citizens, could start doing something. I think it's fairly clear there's going to be mass movements of people to more favoured areas, almost inevitably. And so in those more favoured areas, there's going to be competition for water and other resources, and conflict, almost inevitably. We could all start getting training in conflict resolution. Maybe make it compulsory for politicians. And I think that would help the world in many ways. I hope you've appreciated, sir, how much what you've said has resonated with this audience and how very, very much it has been appreciated. Thank you for a superb talk, sir.
Thank you.